Evangeline Vance didn't know the polished stone floors of the lichen throne room were permanently stained with the blood of failed diplomats. She didn't know the heavily armored pack lords surrounding her viewed her steady, quiet pulse as a dinner bell. And she definitely didn't know that the ancient, dormant magic of the werewolf empire was about to wake for the first time in a millennia. All she knew was the biting, unforgiving cold. The obsidian fortress was not built for human comfort. It was a monument to apex predators carved directly from the black, jagged spine of the northern mountains. The architecture itself was an act of intimidation. Massive pillars of dark stone reached up into shadows, so thick they seemed to swallow the light from the flickering iron torches. The air inside the grand chamber was heavy, thick with the scent of ozone, crushed pine, and the terrifying, musky undercurrent of dozens of alpha and beta wolves gathered in one space. The sheer ambient pressure in the room was enough to make a normal human drop to their knees and weep from the biological terror alone. But the young human archivist did not weep. She kept her head bowed and her spine straight. Evangeline stood alone in the center of the vast floor, her modest, heavy wool cloak wrapped tightly around her slender frame. Her fingers were numb, aching from the 3-day journey through the frozen wilderness, but they maintained a death grip on the single most important object in her world, the obsidian treaty scroll. It was a thick roll of cured leather, bound by a silver cord and stamped with a crumbling wax seal. It represented the only legal protection her fragile enclave had against the encroaching lichen hunting parties. If she failed to renew it today, her people would not survive the winter. High above her, seated on raised, semicircular tiers of dark stone, the pack lords of the High Council stared down at the solitary human. Their eyes, varying shades of amber, yellow, and violent green, gleamed in the gloom like predators circling a wounded doe in the snow. They were waiting for her to break. They were waiting for the trembling to start, for the frantic, submissive stuttering that usually accompanied humans foolish enough to cross the threshold of the royal court. "You bring a piece of rotting hide into our sanctuary, human," a voice boomed, shattering the tense silence. It was a sound like grinding boulders, deep and vibrating with malicious amusement, and you expect us to honor a promise made by ghosts. Lord Garrick Boris stepped out from the shadows of the secondary tier, his heavy boots striking the obsidian floor with the deliberate heavy rhythm of an executioner. He was a massive, scarred warlord, a lichen of terrifying proportions who viewed humans as nothing more than cattle. His dark hair was threaded with silver, and his face bore the jagged, pale lines of countless border wars. He did not merely walk down the stone steps, he stalked, the sheer physical mass of his body radiating heat and violence. Evangeline did not step back as the towering lord approached. Her heart hammered a frantic, desperate rhythm against her ribs, but she ruthlessly commanded her breathing to remain slow and even. She knew the beasts could smell fear. She could not stop the biological reaction of her pulse, but she could control her dignity. "I bring the word of the first sovereign, Lord Garrick," Evangeline replied, her voice remarkably clear, ringing out across the cavernous space. It was not loud, but it possessed a quiet, unyielding steel that made several of the surrounding lords twitch in surprise. "This ancestral charter is not a request. It is a historical covenant. The boundaries of the Oakhaven Enclave were drawn by the original lichen monarchs, paid for in human blood and tribute. I am here to respectfully register its renewal, as required by your own ancient laws." Garrick paused, stopping mere inches from her. The proximity was suffocating. Evangeline had to tilt her head all the way back just to meet his eyes. The smell of him was overwhelming. Stale blood, wet fur, and the bitter tang of cruelty. He leaned down, towering over her, deliberately invading her physical space to trigger her prey instincts. "Ancient laws," the warlord mocked, his lips peeling back to reveal elongated, razor-sharp canines. A low, vibrating growl rumbled in the center of his massive chest. "The only law in the north is power. Little mouse, your enclave offers nothing. You possess no strength, no magic, no fangs. You are a parasite feeding on our lands. I should snap your delicate neck right here and save the council the time of a formal debate." A cruel chorus of low laughter rippled through the elevated tiers. The other pack lords leaned forward, their eyes flashing, eager to see blood spilled on the polished stone. Evangeline's grip on the ancient hide tightened until her knuckles turned stark white. The instinct to run, to curl into a ball and beg for mercy, screamed in the primitive part of her brain. But she forced the terror down into a dark, locked box inside her mind. Because begging wouldn't have changed the outcome. These creatures despised weakness above all else. If she showed a single crack in her armor, she would be dead before she hit the floor. "If you snap my neck, my lord, you will be in direct violation of the right of sanctuary," Evangeline stated, her tone maddeningly clinical, as if she were reciting a textbook rather than negotiating for her life. She looked directly into his violent amber eyes. A recognized emissary, holding the royal seal, cannot be harmed before the Alpha King hears the petition. To strike me down is to challenge the throne itself. Are you formally declaring a challenge against your king, Lord Garrick? The laughter in the chamber abruptly died. Garrick's eyes flared with sudden, unrestrained fury. The muscles in his massive arms corded, and the sound of his claws extending, a sharp metallic snicked, echoed clearly in the sudden silence. For a human to use their own sacred laws against them, to corner a high lord with mere words, was an unprecedented insult. He raised a massive clawed hand, the air around him rippling with aggressive, lethal intent. Evangeline did not flinch. She simply held the scroll tighter, bracing her body for the devastating impact, praying only that her death would be swift. But the blow never came. Before Garrick could swing his arm, the atmosphere in the grand chamber fundamentally altered. It did not happen slowly. It was a violent, instantaneous shift in the very fabric of the air, as if all the oxygen had been violently sucked out of the room. The temperature, already freezing, plummeted to an unnatural bone-atching absolute zero. The heavy iron torches lining the black stone walls flickered wildly. The orange flames flared a brilliant, ghostly blue for a fraction of a second before dimming down to mere suffocated embers. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to elongate, crawling across the floor like living things. A sound echoed from the far end of the hall, the heavy, rhythmic thud of approaching footsteps. Evangeline watched in stunned silence as the terrifying Lord Garrick bore us. A beast who had been a second away from tearing her throat out instantly collapsed in on himself. His broad shoulders hunched, his claws retracted, and he took a rapid, stumbling step backward. All around the vast, semicircular tiers, the arrogant pack lords dropped to their knees in perfect, terrifying unison. The sound of dozens of heavy bodies hitting the stone floor in absolute submission echoed like a drumbeat. The primal, biological compulsion to submit was so overwhelming that Evangeline physically felt it pressing against her shoulders, trying to force her to her knees. She didn't understand the magic of the lichens, but she understood raw, absolute power. At the far end of the grand chamber, the iron deadbolts of the obsidian fortress groaned. These were massive blocks of forged iron, enchanted by ancient blood magic, designed to seal the royal court from the rest of the world. They unlocked with a series of deafening, metallic cracks that echoed like cannon fire. The colossal double doors swung open, pushed by unseen, invisible hands. Then he stepped through. Alpha King Caelan Valerius had arrived. Evangeline's breath caught in her throat, refusing to leave her lungs. The stories in the human enclaves spoke of the Lichen King as a walking nightmare. They called him the Sovereign of Shadows, a cursed, feral beast who had slaughtered rival armies single-handedly, a monster whose very presence rotted the ground beneath his feet. Mothers used his name to frighten children into obedience. Evangeline had spent the last 3 days mentally preparing herself to face a grotesque, scarred abomination of nature. She slowly raised her eyes from the floor, tracing the edge of a heavy black velvet cloak trimmed in the dark fur of a massive northern wolf. She saw tall, immaculate leather boots, the tailored cut of dark, royal garments that spoke of martial discipline and immense wealth, and then she looked at his face. The world tilted on its axis. Evangeline's mind went entirely blank, completely unable to reconcile the monstrous reputation with the reality standing before her. He was not a monster. He was breathtaking. Caelan Valerius possessed a striking, majestic beauty that seemed almost entirely devoid of human flaw. His features were carved with the sharp, aristocratic precision of marble statues in the old world temples. He had a strong, regal jawline, high cheekbones that caught the dim light, and thick, midnight dark hair that swept back from his forehead in an elegant, untamed wave. But it was his eyes that seized her soul and refused to let go. They were the color of molten gold, vibrant, piercing, and swirling with an ancient, dangerous intelligence. He moved with a fluid, terrifying grace that completely contradicted his massive size. He was taller and broader than Garrick, yet there was no brutal clumsiness in his steps. Every movement was calculated, perfectly controlled, predatory perfection. As he walked down the center aisle, the shadows seemed to physically cling to his cloak, reaching out like loyal hounds eager for his touch. The silence in the room was absolute. No one dared to breathe. The pack lords kept their foreheads pressed to the cold stone, trembling under the suffocating weight of his aura. Evangeline stood frozen. She should have dropped to her knees. She should have lowered her eyes like the rest of the beasts, but she was trapped in his gravitational pull, entirely captivated by the severe, haunting beauty of his face. As he drew closer, a strange, impossible phenomenon began to occur. The freezing cold of the throne room, the icy dread that had been sitting in her stomach for 3 days, suddenly fractured. A pinprick of warmth ignited deep within the center of her chest. It was a physical sensation, like a tiny ember catching fire in a dark, empty hearth. As the Alpha King's heavy boots closed the distance, the warmth began to spread, uncurling through her veins, chasing away the numbness in her trembling fingers. She smelled it then, cutting through the heavy stench of the pack lords, a scent of crushed cedar, winter frost, and something incredibly clean and ancient. Caelan did not look at Garrick. He did not look at the kneeling council. He walked straight past the massive warlord, as if the man were nothing more than dust on the floor. His molten gold eyes locked entirely onto Evangeline. The impact of his gaze was like a sudden, breathless strike to her chest. It was entirely too intense, too focused, burning with a sudden, startling intensity that stripped away every defense she had carefully built. He stopped barely an arm's length away from her. The sheer, overwhelming size of him blotted out the rest of the room. Evangeline had to tilt her head back even further to maintain eye contact, her heart now racing not with diplomatic terror, but with a wild, foreign, and entirely biological panic. She didn't know why her skin was suddenly flushed with heat. She didn't know why the air between them felt as thick and charged as the atmosphere, right before a devastating lightning strike. She kept her head lifted, staring up at the striking, noble features of the most dangerous creature on the continent, utterly helpless against the strange golden tide rushing through her blood. The silence that stretched between them was not merely the absence of sound. It was a living, breathing entity, heavy with a pressure that threatened to crush the very stone beneath their feet. Evangeline's lungs burned, desperately craving oxygen, yet her chest refused to expand. Every instinct ingrained in her mortal frame screamed at her to avert her gaze, to bare her throat in ultimate submission, to collapse onto the frozen obsidian floor and pray that the Alpha King would grant her a swift end. But the golden tide in her veins countermanded every survival reflex she possessed. It was a terrifying, paradoxical warmth, a slow, intoxicating heat that originated from the center of her chest and bloomed outward, melting the ice that had settled in her bones during her 3-day trek through the wilderness. Caelan Valerius did not move. He stood with the absolute, terrifying stillness of an apex predator perfectly content to observe its prey before the final strike. His burning amber gaze was impossibly deep, swirling with an ancient, unfathomable intelligence that seemed to dissect her very soul. He was not looking at her the way the other Lycan lords did. He did not see a meal, a nuisance, or a weak political pawn. He was staring at her with a raw, intense curiosity that was infinitely more dangerous. The sheer proximity of him was overwhelming. He was a towering monument of dark velvet, fur, and lethal grace. The scent of him, crushed cedar, biting winter frost, and a clean electric charge like the air right before a massive thunderstorm, enveloped her completely, drowning out the stench of wet fur and stale blood that filled the rest of the throne room. Evangeline's grip on the ancient hide tightened, the cured leather creaking faintly under the desperate pressure of her numb fingers. The sound, though minuscule, echoed like a gunshot in the deathly quiet hall. It was the only tether keeping her anchored to reality, a physical reminder of her duty, her enclave, and the thousands of human lives depending on her survival in this room. She forced herself to take a shallow, trembling breath. The air she inhaled tasted exclusively of him, setting off a new cascade of frantic, biological alarm bells in her mind. Around them, the elevated tiers of the grand chamber remained frozen in a tableau of absolute subjugation. The high lords of the council, massive and terrifying warriors who had spent decades bathing the northern borders in blood, were reduced to trembling masses of muscle and fur, their foreheads pressed flush against the unforgiving stone. Even Lord Garrick Boras, the towering warlord who had been seconds away from tearing her throat out, was breathing in short, ragged gasps, entirely pinned to the floor by the sheer, crushing weight of his king's aura. Elder Cynthia Sterling, the royal physician and ancient lawkeeper, watched intently from a darkened alcove of the upper tier, her expression calculating. But ambitious men, even when brought to their knees, rarely know when to remain silent. The agonizing tension was suddenly shattered by the harsh, grinding sound of armor scraping against stone. Lord Garrick Boras, his pride clearly warring with his biological compulsion to submit, shifted his massive weight. He did not dare to stand, but he raised his scarred face from the floor, his violent amber eyes darting between the human girl and the Alpha King. The warlord's jaw clenched, his elongated canines clicking together as he forced the words past the suffocating pressure of Kalen's presence. "Alpha King?" Lord Garrick grated, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. This human creature has breached the sanctity of the High Council. She stands in the center of this royal stronghold, demanding we honor a worthless piece of rotting leather. She is an insult to the crown. I was merely preparing to dispose of the filth before she could soil your sight." Evangeline's heart performed a terrifying, frantic stutter. The warmth that had been pooling in her chest was instantly chased away by a violent spike of adrenaline. She braced herself for the Alpha King's response, fully expecting him to nod, to give the unspoken command that would end her life in a spray of crimson. She had read the histories. She knew that Kalen Valerius did not tolerate disrespect, and a human standing unbowed in his presence was the ultimate heresy. But Kalen did not nod. He did not issue a command. In fact, he did not even look at the warlord. For a long, agonizing moment, the Alpha King simply continued to stare down at Evangeline. His expression remained entirely unreadable, an immaculate mask of aristocratic indifference. Then, with agonizing slowness, he shifted his gaze. He did not turn his head. He merely slid his piercing, metallic stare sideways, pinning the kneeling Lord Garrick with a look of such absolute, freezing contempt that the ambient temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. "Did I grant you permission to speak, Lord Garrick?" Kalen's voice was unlike anything Evangeline had ever heard. It was not a roar. It was not a shout. It was a low, velvet-wrapped blade of a sound, deep and resonant, thrumming with a dark, primal authority that vibrated directly into the marrow of her bones. It was a voice designed to command armies, to break sieges, to force the very earth to kneel. Lord Garrick flinched violently, as if he had been physically struck across the jaw. The massive warlord's chest heaved, a bead of cold sweat tracing the jagged scar on his cheek. "No, Alpha." But the human, Kalen interrupted, his voice dropping half an octave into a terrifying guttural purr, is standing exactly where she is supposed to be. And you, Lord Garrick, are currently bleeding your foul stench all over my floor. If you open your mouth again without my explicit command, I will remove your tongue and feed it to the ravens." A collective, silent shudder rippled through the semicircular tiers. Dozens of heavily armored pack lords pressed themselves even flatter against the obsidian floor, desperately trying to shrink their massive frames into invisibility. The warlord squeezed his eyes shut, his jaw working furiously, but he bowed his head, submitting to the absolute threat. The silence reclaimed the grand chamber, heavier and more oppressive than before. Having silenced the antagonist with barely a fraction of his attention, Kalen slowly turned his full, devastating focus back to the fragile human standing before him. The Alpha King took a single deliberate step forward. Evangeline's breath hitched, trapping a quiet gasp in her throat. The physical pressure of his aura intensified exponentially, wrapping around her like a heavy, suffocating blanket. He was now so close that she could see the individual, infinitesimal flecks of deeper amber swimming within the molten gold of his irises. She could see the faint, almost imperceptible pulse beating steadily at the base of his strong, corded neck. The heat radiating from his massive body was astonishing, completely overriding the freezing chill of the stone hall. It was a magnetic, dangerous warmth, pulling at her senses, demanding she step closer, demanding she surrender. "You do not kneel," Kalen murmured, his voice barely louder than a whisper, yet it echoed with terrifying clarity in the cavernous space. He tilted his head slightly, a dark lock of midnight hair falling across his forehead, casting a sharp shade over his striking cheekbones. Evangeline swallowed hard, fighting the overwhelming urge to close her eyes and lean into his warmth. Her mind was a chaotic storm of political strategy, raw terror, and a bizarre, irrational sense of safety. She had spent years studying lichen etiquette, memorizing the precise angles of submission, the exact tones of subservience required to survive an encounter with a superior predator. But looking up into his face, she found herself entirely incapable of bowing. I am the appointed emissary of Oakhaven, Alpha King," she managed to say. To her immense credit, her voice did not break, though it lacked the commanding steel she had used against Lord Garrick Boras. "I carry the seal of my people. I stand as their representative, not as a subject of the pack." A faint, almost imperceptible shift occurred in Kalen's eyes. A spark of genuine amusement, or perhaps a flare of predatory interest. It was impossible to tell. He raised a hand, his movement slow, deliberate, and exquisitely graceful. Evangeline's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird as he reached out, his long, powerful fingers brushing against the edge of the bound parchment she held clutched against her chest. The moment his skin grazed the cured leather, close enough that the back of his knuckles brushed against her frozen fingers, a violent electrical shock arsed through her body. Evangeline gasped aloud, her eyes widening in pure shock. It wasn't static. It was a deep, resonating jolt that bypassed her nervous system entirely and struck directly at her soul. The tiny ember of warmth in her chest exploded into a raging inferno, flooding her veins with a sudden, overwhelming heat that left her dizzy and breathless. She stumbled back half a step, her boots scraping against the polished stone, her mind reeling from the sheer, incomprehensible intensity of the contact. Kalen froze. The Alpha King's hand remained suspended in the air between them. His broad shoulders stiffened, the relaxed predatory grace evaporating in an instant, replaced by a rigid, statuesque tension. The pupils of his golden eyes blew wide, swallowing the amber irises entirely, till his eyes were nothing but deep, bottomless pools of obsidian. A low, vibrating sound began to build in the center of his chest. Not a growl of anger, but a deep, rumbling purr of absolute primal recognition. The air pressure in the room shifted again, becoming thick, sweet, and suffocatingly heavy. The scent of crushed cedar and winter frost intensified, but it was now laced with something else, a rich, intoxicating sweetness that smelled like sun-warmed honey and blooming night jasmine. It was the scent of a soul bond awakening. The ancient, dormant magic of the werewolf empire, a legend written only in the oldest, dustiest tomes, was actively weaving a golden, metaphysical thread between the terrifying Alpha King and the fragile human archivist. Elder Cynthia Sterling, watching from her vantage point, gripped the stone railing tightly as she recognized the scent instantly. Evangeline didn't understand the magic. She didn't know that the biological imperative of the Lycan race was currently rewriting the entire political landscape of the continent. All she knew was that she felt like she was burning alive, and the only source of relief, the only anchor in the spinning, chaotic universe, was the magnificent, dangerous man standing before her. Kalen slowly lowered his hand, his massive chest rising and falling with suddenly ragged breaths. The absolute control he had displayed mere moments ago was fracturing, cracking along the edges to reveal the desperate, feral beast beneath the royal facade. He took another step forward, entirely closing the distance between them. The tips of his immaculate leather boots touched the hem of her heavy wool cloak. He leaned down, his towering frame curving over her, caging her in his massive silhouette. The proximity was absolute. The heat radiating from him was a physical weight, pressing against her skin. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice completely stripped of its previous cold amusement. It was raspy, desperate, and heavily laced with a raw, undeniable hunger. "What is your name, human?" Evangeline's mind was entirely offline. The brilliant, logical archivist who had memorized 1,000 years of border treaties was gone, replaced by a woman drowning in a sensory overload of heat, scent, and striking, unparalleled beauty. She stared up into his face, mapping the sharp, aristocratic lines of his jaw, the perfect curve of his mouth, the intense, mesmerizing darkness of his dilated eyes. He was so close she could feel the ghost of his breath against her flushed cheek. The aggressive cross-examination by Lord Garrick, the threat of execution, the freezing cold of the northern mountains, everything faded into absolute insignificance. There was only him, only the overwhelming, majestic presence of the Alpha King. "Evangeline," she breathed, the words slipping past her lips on a soft exhale. "My name is Evangeline." Kalen's eyes fluttered shut for a fraction of a second, his jaw clenching as if the sound of her name was a devastating strike to his senses. He leaned in even closer, his nose brushing against the crown of her head as he inhaled deeply, dragging her scent directly into his lungs. A violent shudder ripped through his massive frame. "You are shaking, Evangeline," he murmured, his voice a dark, vibrating hum against her ear. The sound sent a cascade of shivers down her spine, pooling heavy and warm low in her stomach. He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes again, testing her, pushing her to the absolute breaking point. "Are you terrified of the monster they told you about? Are you afraid I will tear you apart?" Little emissary, the young woman, looked at him. She looked at the flawless, sculpted perfection of his face, the dark, untamed hair, the eyes that burned with a protective, possessive fire she couldn't possibly comprehend. The rational part of her brain was screaming at her to agree, to play the submissive prey, to beg for her life. But the intoxicating heat of the bond, the golden tide rushing through her veins, entirely dismantled her filter. She didn't see a monster. She didn't see a feral beast. She saw a king, tragic and beautiful, burdened by a heavy crown of obsidian. "No," Evangeline whispered, her voice trembling, not with fear, but with a profound, overwhelming awe. The words escaped her before she could even process them, a devastating slip of the tongue born from pure, unfiltered instinct. "You are incredibly handsome, Alpha King." The words hung in the air, delicate and fragile, echoing through the cavernous expanse of the grand chamber. For 3 seconds, the world stopped turning. The silence that followed her confession was so absolute, so profound. It felt as though time itself had shattered into a million frozen pieces. Not a single breath was drawn. Not a single heart dared to beat. The heavy iron torches lining the walls seemed to pause in their flickering. Evangeline immediately slapped a hand over her mouth. her eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated horror at what she had just done. She had just called the most dangerous, ruthless warlord in history, a man known for slaughtering thousands, handsome, right in the middle of his royal court, in front of the High Council. It was an act of such staggering suicidal audacity that her brain simply shut down in defense. But Caelan Valerius did not strike her. He did not roar in outrage. Instead, the Alpha King completely broke open. The shock that rippled across his striking features was visceral, a raw, unguarded vulnerability that stripped away the terrifying Alpha King and left only a desperate, starving man. His dilated pupils swallowed the last ring of gold, his chest heaving as if he had been running for 100 miles. The golden thread between them, previously a fragile, metaphysical connection, suddenly snapped into place with the force of a falling star, locking tight, fusing their souls together in a violent explosion of ancient magic. The scent in the room changed instantly. The sweet, intoxicating aroma of sun-warmed honey and night jasmine amplified 1,000-fold, mixing inextricably with Caelan's crushed cedar and frost. It was a biological flare, a blinding beacon of fated mate recognition that washed over the entire throne room. The reaction from the High Council was instantaneous and catastrophic. The Pack Lords, still kneeling on the cold stone, suddenly realized what they were smelling. The absolute, primal shock of an Alpha King finding his fated mate, a human, no less, shattered the suffocating grip of his aura. Head snapped up all around the semicircular tiers. Eyes flared with a chaotic mixture of disbelief, horror, and sudden, malicious calculation. Lord Garrick Boris was the first to react. The warlord's violent amber eyes locked onto Evangeline, the initial shock rapidly morphing into cold, predatory realization. She was no longer just a human archivist holding a rotting treaty. She was the Alpha King's fated mate. She was his soul, his heart, walking around outside of his chest. She was his ultimate, crippling vulnerability. If the rival factions wanted to break Caelan Valerius, they no longer needed to defeat his armies. They only needed to snap the delicate neck of the human girl, standing in the center of the room. Lord Garrick slowly rose to his feet, a low, rumbling growl building in his throat. Across the chamber, 3 other rival lords followed suit, their muscles cording, their claws extending. The political dynamic of the room shifted in a heartbeat, transforming from a court of law into a slaughterhouse. Evangeline saw the murderous intent flashing in Lord Garrick's eyes. She took a terrified step backward, her hand dropping from her mouth, finally understanding the true, lethal danger of her situation. She was going to die, right here on the obsidian floor, torn apart by ambitious warlords desperate to cripple their king. But she had vastly underestimated the possessive, feral instinct of a Lycan king who had just found his mate. Caelan did not just sense the shift in the room. He felt the murderous intent directed at his newly discovered bond as a physical blade dragging against his own skin. The transition from stunned, vulnerable man to absolute, apocalyptic nightmare was instantaneous. He did not look at Lord Garrick. He did not need to. Caelan spun around, moving with a blinding, explosive speed that blurred his massive form. He threw his arm out toward the far end of the grand hall, his fingers spread wide, tapping into the ancient, blood-bound magic that flowed through the very foundations of the fortress. The air in the chamber violently imploded. With a sound like a mountain tearing itself apart, the iron deadbolts of the obsidian fortress reacted to their master's command. The colossal double doors, which had stood open to the courtyard, violently slammed shut, with a concussive boom that shook the dust from the vaulted ceilings. The massive, enchanted iron deadbolts, thick as tree trunks, shot across the frames with a series of deafening, metallic cracks, sealing the throne room entirely from the outside world. No one could enter, and more importantly, no one could leave. The sudden darkness was absolute, save for the blue flaring torches that danced wildly in the violently shifting air currents. Caelan Valerius turned back to face the High Council, placing his massive, broad body directly between the fragile human and the rising Pack Lords. He shielded her completely, a towering wall of dark velvet and lethal muscle. His hands curled into fists, his claws fully extended, dripping with raw, aggressive power. His blazing irises burned like twin suns in the gloom, sweeping over the ambitious lords with a promise of unimaginable violence. He threw his head back, his fangs bared, and let out a sound that would haunt the nightmares of every creature in that room for the rest of their unnatural lives. It was not a word, it was a roar. A deep, earth-shattering, primal declaration that vibrated through the stone, rattled the iron torches in their sconces, and thundered through the newly forged mate bond, striking Evangeline's heart with staggering force. Mine! The single syllable exploded through the grand chamber, a definitive absolute claim that invoked the oldest, most sacred laws of the werewolf empire. It was a promise of protection, a vow of slaughter, and a terrifying warning to anyone foolish enough to even look at her. The rival lords froze in their tracks, struck physically backward by the sheer concussive force of his roar. Lord Garrick stumbled, his face draining of colour as he stared at the wrathful king. They had intended to exploit a weakness, but in doing so, they had awakened a monster far more terrifying than the legends claimed. Evangeline stood paralyzed behind the protective expanse of his back, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The fear was gone, entirely burned away by the overwhelming, consuming heat of his claim. The word still echoed in her bones. Mine, not used, not owned, chosen, protected. Kaelan slowly lowered his head, his chest heaving, his gaze locked on the terrifying warlords who dared to threaten what was his. He did not turn around to look at Evangeline, but she felt his voice, a low, vibrating hum that travelled directly through the golden thread connecting their souls, bypassing the air entirely to speak straight into her mind. Do not move, do not speak. You are safe now, my little emissary. The standoff in the sealed throne room had just begun. The heavy doors were locked tight. The air was thick with the scent of an awakened mate bond and the bitter tang of impending violence. Evangeline gripped the historical covenant, the fragile's piece of leather feeling entirely insignificant compared to the massive, deadly king who had just claimed her as his own. She had come to negotiate a treaty with a monster, and instead, she had accidentally bound herself to a god. The absolute stillness following the sovereign's gruesome threat felt like a physical, suffocating weight that pressed the remaining oxygen from the grand chamber. The biological math of survival was a primal equation, an absolute truth that overrode even the most deeply ingrained arrogance. No amount of political ambition could shield a man from the sheer, crushing pressure of a Lycan king protecting his fated mate. Lord Garrick Boris's massive chest heaved like a bellows, his violent amber eyes dilating with raw, unfiltered terror. He stared at the newly sealed iron deadbolts, the very instruments of their total imprisonment, and then back to the dripping, unsheathed claws of his ruler. The warlord's heavy jaw clicked shut. Inch by agonizing inch, he lowered his scarred face back toward the frozen obsidian floor. He did not issue a rebuttal. He did not dare to breathe too loudly. He did not even twitch. The total submission of his posture was a surrender broadcast to every dominant instinct in the room. The rebellion was, for the moment, completely and utterly crushed beneath the heel of a fully awakened apex predator. Satisfied by the absolute capitulation of his enemies, Kaelan dismissed the threat entirely. The lethal, world-ending tension corded in his broad shoulders evaporated the second he turned his back on the High Council. To present one's spine to a room full of hostile, armored Lycans was an act of such staggering confidence it bordered on sheer madness. But the Alpha King did not care. His universe had abruptly, violently shrunk to the radius of the fragile human standing on his floor. The adrenaline that had kept Evangeline upright for the past 20 minutes finally snapped. It was not a graceful descent, the sheer, biting cold of the northern mountains, suppressed temporarily by the shock of the diplomatic standoff, and the sudden, violent ignition of ancient magic came rushing back into her bloodstream with a vengeance. Her mortal frame was simply not equipped to process the staggering amount of raw power, now tethering her soul to a lichen monarch. Her knees simply ceased to function. The heavy wool of her modest cloak offered zero protection against the sudden, violent shivering that seized her frame. The magic wasn't just warm, it was ancient, heavy, and designed for a biology with a wolf's constitution. In her human veins, it felt like a chaotic storm battling glacial ice. The edges of her vision began to blur into a static grey. She never hit the stone. His movement was a seamless blur of shadow, leaving no time to register the distance before he was there. A solid wall of radiating heat pressed flush against her side. His massive arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her against his broad chest with a gentleness that entirely contradicted his monstrous reputation. The impact knocked the remaining breath from her lungs, replacing it instantly with the overwhelming, intoxicating scent of crushed cedar, winter frost, and the deep, sweet honey of their shared connection. "I have you," Kalen murmured. His voice was a low, vibrating hum that bypassed her ears and resonated directly against her ribs. The sound was rough, laced with a raw, desperate anxiety that made her heart stutter. "You are safe. Just breathe." Without asking for permission, the sovereign swept her off her feet. Evangeline let out a soft gasp as the ground vanished beneath her boots. He held her easily against his chest, as if she weighed no more than a handful of dry leaves. He did not carry her toward the exit. The massive double doors were sealed tight, fusing the throne room into an impenetrable vault of black stone. Instead, he carried her up the elevated, sweeping steps of the royal dais, ascending toward the massive throne carved from a single block of volcanic glass. No human had ever set foot on the elevated platform in the recorded history of the Empire. The stone beneath them seemed to hum with centuries of residual magic, an ancient power that recognized the true Luna of the pack. He did not place her on the freezing seat of power. Instead, Kalen sank to his knees on the thick, midnight blue rugs that lined the upper platform, cradling her securely in his lap. The contrast between the hostile environment of the cavernous hall and the blistering heat of his body was staggering. Evangeline's teeth chattered, her fingers still locked in a death grip around the cured leather of the precious document. She tried to pull away, her archivist's mind screaming that this level of intimacy with a foreign monarch was a severe breach of protocol, but her own body betrayed her. The golden soul bond thread, a sensation she could now vividly feel as a river of liquid gold pulsing in the center of her chest, pulled her relentlessly toward his warmth. "Your hands are like ice," the king rasped. Kalen unclasped the heavy silver chain at his throat. With a single fluid motion, he stripped off his magnificent royal mantle, a massive expanse of dark velvet lined with thick northern fur, and draped it completely over her trembling shoulders. The cloak was huge, swallowing her slender frame entirely. It carried his concentrated heat and his grounding scent, acting as a physical, protective barrier against the freezing air of the chamber. Then, the ruthless warlord who had just threatened to mount the heads of his council on spikes did the unthinkable. He took her small, frost-bitten hands in his massive, clawed ones. He brought her knuckles to his mouth. Parting his lips slightly to breathe a stream of hot, soothing air over her pale skin, Evangeline remained utterly paralyzed by shock. The dark, aristocratic perfection of his face was mere inches from hers, every sharp angle and shadowed contour illuminated by the dim, flickering torchlight of the great hall. She could observe the devastating focus in his molten gold eyes, a color so bright and violent it seemed to burn through the gloom. Watching the way his pupils expanded and contracted in rhythm with her own racing pulse. His thumbs, rough with calluses and tipped with lethal, retracted talons, rubbed small, agonizingly gentle circles into her numb palms, forcing the stagnant blood to circulate. "I did not know," Kalen whispered against her skin, his voice cracking under the weight of a century of total isolation. "I have searched the continent for 70 years. I tore apart rival packs. I burned down forests, searching for the other half of my soul. I did not know the moon goddess had hidden you in the human enclaves. If I had known, I would have torn the mountains down to bring you here in the warmth, rather than let you walk through the snow. The sheer, unguarded vulnerability in his confession struck her right in the ribs. This was not a tyrant. This was a man who had been starving in the dark, entirely hollowed out by a biological imperative he could not satisfy, suddenly handed a feast of blinding light. "I am just an archivist," Evangeline breathed, her voice trembling as the warmth finally began to chase the numbness from her extremities. "I don't have magic. I don't have a wolf. I am fragile." Kaelan ceased rubbing her hands. He lifted his head, his golden eyes locking onto hers with a possessive, burning intensity that made the breath catch in her throat. "You are my Luna," he stated, the words carrying the absolute immovable weight of a natural law. "You are not fragile. You stood before the most dangerous predators on this earth, holding nothing but a piece of old leather. And you did not flinch. And then..." A faint, devastatingly beautiful ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "You called me handsome. While my council was preparing to execute you, I have never witnessed such magnificent bravery in my entire cursed life." A hot flush of deep crimson rapidly painted Evangeline's cheeks at the reminder of her suicidal slip of the tongue. She dropped her gaze, staring at the broad expanse of his chest, suddenly hyper-aware of the hard, corded muscle shifting beneath his tailored garments. Before she could form a coherent apology, a quiet, deliberate throat was cleared from the bottom of the dais steps. Elder Cynthia Sterling stood at the edge of the elevated platform. The royal physician kept her eyes respectfully lowered, fully aware of the lethal danger of approaching a lichen king who was actively nesting with a newly discovered mate. In her hands, she carried a small leather-bound flask. "Forgive the intrusion, Alpha," the healer spoke, her tone perfectly even, designed to project calm into the highly volatile atmosphere. "But the human's nervous system is currently processing a massive influx of ancient lichen magic. The sudden activation of the bond, combined with extreme physical exhaustion, could send her heart into a fatal arrhythmia. She requires the warming draft, immediately." A low, terrifying growl instantly vibrated, deep within Kaelan's chest. His dominant instincts flared at the perceived threat of another person intervening, his massive arms tightening around Evangeline protectively. "She is fine," he snapped, his fangs briefly extending. "I am healing her. Your heat is keeping her from freezing." "My king," Cynthia countered bravely, taking one deliberate, heavily telegraphed step up the dais. "But you cannot regulate a human heartbeat with a lichen aura. She is shaking because the magic is trying to integrate with a body that has no vessel to hold it. Let me do my job, or you will lose her before the sun sets." The stark, clinical truth of the elder's words pierced through the feral haze of the king's possessive instinct. Kaelan's jaw clenched so hard the bone audibly popped. He gazed down at Evangeline, realizing with a spike of horror that despite his heavy cloak and his burning touch, a fine sheen of cold sweat had broken out across her forehead. Her pupils were slightly dilated, her breathing shallow and uneven. The magical shock was actively tearing at her fragile biology. "Come forward," he commanded, his voice tight with suppressed panic. "With caution." The physician ascended the steps, uncorking the flask. The sharp, medicinal scent of crushed willow bark and fermented fireroot cut through the heavy aroma of the bond. Kaelan gently shifted Evangeline in his lap, supporting the back of her head with a large, warm hand. "Drink," the sovereign coaxed, taking the flask from Cynthia and bringing it to Evangeline's pale lips. "It will taste like ash, but you must swallow it. For me." She obeyed. The liquid was incredibly thick, carrying the sharp tang of wild earth and old magic, burning a fiery trail down her throat and into her stomach. Almost instantly, the violent shivering began to subside, the terrifying, erratic fluttering of her heart smoothed out into a strong, steady rhythm. The cloying grey static at the edge of her vision dissolved entirely, bringing the sharp, dark architecture of the mountain keep back into painful focus. As the physical crisis passed, the political reality of their situation crashed down upon her with the force of a tidal wave. Evangeline shifted, pushing herself up slightly against the king's chest. She peered past the protective expanse of his shoulder, examining the cavernous depths of the sealed throne room. At the far end of the hall, near the massive iron deadbolts that trapped them all inside, the hostile council members had retreated into the deep shadows. They were not kneeling anymore. The absolute, crushing weight of Kaelin's aura was currently focused entirely on healing his mate, leaving a vacuum of pressure at the edges of the room. Lord Garrick Boris stood in a tight circle with 3 other heavily scarred pack lords. They were whispering. The acoustic architecture of the grand chamber was designed to carry sound directly to the throne. And although they spoke in hushed, guttural tones, the newly forged mate bond had severely heightened Evangeline's sensory perception. She could hear the malicious, calculated scrape of their words. The laws of the First Council. Garrick was hissing, his amber eyes darting toward the dais with toxic hatred. The king's sanity can be legally challenged if the chosen Luna presents a direct, existential threat to the survival of the packs. She is human. She cannot bear Lycan heirs. She cannot survive the winter ceremonies. If we petition the Northern Territories, we can strip his crown legally before he can slaughter us. Another lord, a gaunt man with a missing eye, nodded in deliberate measure. The magical trace of the bond has already altered the fortress's wards. The outer packs will sense the shift. If we stall him here in this sealed room long enough, my brother will assume we have been taken hostage and rally the border armies. A stealth assault on the gates. We capture the human alive, we break the king's mind. They were plotting a coup right in front of him. They knew they could not defeat Kaelin in a direct, physical confrontation, so they were pivoting to a stealthy, political assassination. They intended to use the ancient laws of the werewolf empire to invalidate her very existence, turning her from a miraculous discovery into a catastrophic liability. A cold, familiar clarity washed over Evangeline. The terror that had paralyzed her earlier completely vanished, replaced by the sharp, analytical focus that made her the most brilliant archivist in the human realm. The shelves of dust-covered tomes, the endless nights deciphering faded ink, it all culminated in this exact razor-edge moment of survival. She was not a warrior. She could not fight a warlord with her fists. But she knew the law. She knew the ancient texts infinitely better than the illiterate, blood-soaked warlords plotting in the dark. Evangeline sat up, pushing the heavy fur hood of the royal mantle back from her face. She ignored the warning growl that rumbled in Kaelin's chest at her sudden movement. She reached down into the folds of her modest dress and retrieved the object she had nearly died to present, the sworn royal pact. "My king," she said, her voice no longer trembling. It rang out crisp and clear, startling the physician beside them. Kaelin turned his gaze to her, his golden eyes narrowing in confusion at the sudden, absolute shift in her demeanor. The fragile, terrified girl was gone. In her place sat a woman whose eyes burned with a fierce, undeniable intelligence. "You are plotting to kill them," she whispered, keeping her voice low enough that the sound did not carry to the far end of the hall. "I can feel it through the bond. You are calculating exactly how long it will take to cross the room and tear Lord Garrick's throat out." Kaelin's jaw tightened. "It will take me exactly 4 seconds, and I will enjoy every millisecond of it. They threaten what is mine. They forfeit their lives." "No," Evangeline stated firmly, placing a small, pale hand flat against the center of his chest. The physical contact sent a jolt of warm, golden electricity through both of them, temporarily overriding his feral rage. "If you slaughter the High Council while the doors are sealed, you will prove their point. The Northern Territories will rebel. You will plunge the entire empire into a civil war, and thousands of innocent people, both human and Lycan, will burn. I would rather burn the entire kingdom to the ground than allow them to lay a single finger on you." The sovereign snarled, his possessive fury flaring wildly. "I would rather burn with you than freeze alone." The devastating romance of his statement made her breath hitch, but she ruthlessly shoved the emotion aside. She unrolled the thick, cured leather of the scroll across his lap. "You don't have to burn anything," she said, tracing a line of faded, ancient script with her index finger. "Examine the text, Kaelin. Read the original covenant signed by the first Lycan monarch." The king blinked, thrown off balance by her sheer, unyielding competence. He stared at the crumbling document. Section 4, paragraph 2, the archivist recited purely from memory, her voice steady and rhythmic. "Should the blood of the sovereign willingly bind itself to the dirt of the enclave shall immediately and irreversibly be elevated to the status of a royal protectorate." Kaelin went perfectly still. The ruthless, strategic mind that had conquered the northern borders instantly grasped the devastating legal trap Evangeline had just uncovered. "You fight with fangs and claws." "My king," she whispered, meeting his brilliant gilded stare. "Let me fight with ink and law. We will not give them a rebellion. We will give them an execution." The hollow ache in his chest, a pain he had carried for a century, vanished completely. The word thundered through their bond like a war drum, not as a statement of possession, but as a profound, overwhelming declaration of awe. "Mine." The Alpha King rose to his full height, bringing Evangeline with him. The movement was slow, deliberate, and undeniably lethal. He kept one arm firmly anchored around her waist, supporting her weight with effortless strength, but he turned them both to face the vast, shadowed expanse of the sealed throne room. His velvet cloak swallowed her small frame, but her chin was tipped up, her spine perfectly straight. Down in the darkness, Lord Garrick and his conspirators abruptly stopped their whispers as Kaelin's shadow loomed over them, the air in the sealed room growing impossibly colder. "By the very council laws you claim to honor," Evangeline's voice rang out, dropping into a solemn, heavy register that echoed off the stone walls. "A monarch's recognized mate elevates her homeland to an extension of the royal estate. Which means for the last 5 years, Lord Garrick, you have not been raiding human settlements. You have been actively pillaging, burning, and slaughtering on the king's personal territory. Any unprovoked military raid on royal lands is classified as an act of war against the Lycan throne itself. The punishment is not a trial by the council. The mandatory sentence is immediate execution." The realization hit the Grand Chamber like a shockwave. The air itself seemed to crack under the weight of the revelation. It was a legal decapitation executed in absolute, chilling silence. The trap was flawless. Evangeline had taken their arrogance, their reliance on brutal ancient laws, and turned their own sacred text into a guillotine. Garrick's amber eyes widened, the pupils contracting to pinpricks of cold panic. He looked around the room, silently begging for support from the other lords, desperately seeking the alliance they had promised him just moments ago. But the vast hall had grown completely still. The pack leaders, brutal men, who only respected overwhelming strength and absolute law, were staring at the warlord as if he were already a rotting corpse. To defend him now was to openly admit to high treason against the crown. The political alliance crumbled into dust in a matter of seconds. He was completely alone. "She tricked you!" Garrick roared, panic finally shattering his composure. The biological imperative to survive overrode his rational mind. The warlord's body began to rapidly expand, his spine popping and cracking violently as dark, coarse fur erupted along his forearms. He was initiating a forced shift right on the throne room floor, a desperate, suicidal attempt to kill the human before the legal judgment could be finalized and the guards could be summoned. "She is a witch. She has poisoned your mind, Kaelin. I will rip her throat out," he lunged. The massive, half-shifted beast exploded off the obsidian floor, entirely ignoring the monarch and aiming a devastating, clawed strike directly at Evangeline's fragile neck. She didn't have time to scream. She didn't have time to even close her eyes. But begging wouldn't have changed the outcome, and fleeing was biologically impossible. Before Garrick could cover even half the distance to the dais, Kaelin moved. He did not step away from his mate. He did not even bother to extend his own claws, or shift a single muscle into his wolf form. The sovereign simply raised his free hand, his fingers curled into a loose, negligent fist and slammed his palm downward through the freezing air. The ambient gravity in the center of the room instantly multiplied by 1,000. With a sickening, concussive crunch that echoed off the vaulted ceilings, Lord Garrick Boris was violently flattened against the polished stone floor. The invisible, crushing weight of his raw magical aura hit the warlord like a falling mountain. The obsidian tiles beneath Garrick's massive body spiderwebbed, cracking and splintering outward in a massive crater under the sheer, localized pressure. A ragged, blood-choked scream tore from the traitor's throat. His half-shifted bones snapped under the impossible weight, his thick arms pinned uselessly to his sides. He lay completely paralyzed, drowning in a pool of his own making, unable to even lift his chin from the shattered tiles. Calen stood perfectly still on the dais, his large hand resting protectively on Evangeline's shoulder, his face an immaculate mask of cold divine judgment. He looked down at the broken warlord, his glowing auric gaze devoid of any mercy or hesitation. He was the king, and his judgment was absolute. "You do not speak her name," the monarch commanded, his voice vibrating with a dark, lethal resonance that forced every other Lycan in the room to whimper and press their faces back into the floor in total submission. "You do not look at her, and you certainly do not attempt to touch what is mine." The sovereign slowly lowered his raised hand. The crushing gravity lessened just enough to allow the traitor to draw a ragged, wet breath, keeping him alive just long enough to suffer. "Guards," Calen called out. From the deep shadows near the sealed iron deadbolts, 4 members of the Royal Elite Guard, massive, heavily armored Lycans completely loyal to the throne, stepped forward. They had remained entirely neutral during the political standoff, adhering strictly to council law, but the explicit invocation of high treason gave them absolute jurisdiction to act. "Strip him of his titles. Remove his crest," the sovereign ordered coldly, his voice echoing in the silent hall. "Throw him into the salt dungeons beneath the fortress. Let the cold rot the rest of his strength. We will hold a formal, public execution at dawn, so the outer pact can witness exactly what happens to those who threaten the mate of this empire." The guards did not hesitate. They hauled the broken, whimpering mass of the former warlord off the fractured floor, dragging him away toward a secondary, heavily reinforced iron door leading down into the subterranean prisons. Garrick left a thick, dark smear of blood across the polished obsidian tiles, a stark, visceral, visual warning to anyone else harboring thoughts of rebellion. Silence reclaimed the grand chamber. It was no longer a silence of tension, but one of absolute, unquestioning reverence. Calen swept his glowing gaze over the remaining pack lords, who were still trembling in the subservient posture on the lower tiers. "The ancestral decree is ratified," he declared, the finality in his tone echoing like a gavel strike. "The human lands are under my direct, personal protection. If a single human child in that territory wakes up with a cold, I will hold this entire council personally responsible. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, Alpha. Yes, my king." A chorus of desperate, breathless affirmations rose from the floor. Satisfied that the immediate threat was neutralized and the political landscape permanently altered, the feral, dominant energy radiating from the sovereign began to rapidly cool. The blinding gold in his irises darkened, returning to a deep, swirling storm-glass grey before settling back to his natural amber. The terrifying warlord retreated, leaving behind a man who was acutely, painfully aware of the small, shivering woman standing beside him. The fierce, analytical focus that had allowed her to spring the legal trap suddenly ebbed, giving way to a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. The sudden absence of immediate peril left a dizzying vacuum in her chest. Her fingers finally released their death grip on the ancient decree, and it clattered softly onto the stone. Calen wrapped his arms around her, pulling her securely against his chest. The heavy velvet cloak had slipped slightly from her shoulders, exposing her pale neck to the freezing air of the hall. She was completely drained, her skin ashen, her breathing shallow and fast despite the warming draught she had consumed earlier. "You have done enough," he murmured, his voice softening into a rich, velvety texture that sent a cascade of warm shivers down her spine, chasing away the chill. "The battle is over. Let me take care of you now." He turned away from the kneeling council, completely ignoring the stunned pack lords, and lifted her effortlessly into his arms. He carried her toward the back of the royal dais. Elder Cynthia Sterling silently stepped aside, bowing deeply in ultimate respect as they passed. Behind the massive throne of volcanic glass stood a heavy oak door, banded in dark iron and enchanted with privacy wards so dense they hummed against the air. It was the entrance to the monarch's private inner sanctum, a place no member of the council had ever been permitted to enter. Kaelin kicked the heavy door open, stepping through the threshold and letting it slam shut behind them, instantly cutting off the freezing drafts and the suffocating stench of fear in the throne room. The transition was jarring. From the hostile, cavernous expanse of the political arena, Evangeline was suddenly plunged into an environment of overwhelming sensory warmth. The private chambers were not a sterile royal apartment. They were a sanctuary, a carefully constructed nesting room designed for ultimate safety and isolation. The walls were lined with thick, woven tapestries of deep crimson and gold, absorbing sound and retaining heat. A massive stone hearth dominated the far wall, a roaring fire of ancient pine and cedar crackling merrily within it, casting dancing orange shadows across the plush, midnight blue rugs covering the floor. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, old parchment, and the heavy, comforting musk of her mate. It was entirely, profoundly safe. Kaelin carried her toward the center of the room, bypassing a heavy oak writing desk and a wall of meticulously organized bookshelves, heading straight for a massive, low-set bed piled high with thick furs and silks pillows. He did not drop her. He lowered her onto the edge of the mattress with excruciating care, as if she were made of spun glass that might shatter at the slightest rough movement. He knelt on the rug between her knees, refusing to sever the physical contact. His large, warm hands remained resting lightly on her waist, his thumbs tracing slow, grounding circles against the heavy fabric of her dress. "Look at me, Evangeline," he requested quietly. She lifted her heavy eyelids. The striking, aristocratic perfection of his face was softened by the warm firelight. The terrifying apex predator was gone. He looked at her like a man seeing his own heart breathing outside his chest, entirely vulnerable, entirely devoted. "You saved my empire today," Kaelin said, his voice laced with a profound, quiet awe. "I was prepared to slaughter them all. I was prepared to start a war that would have burned for 100 years just to keep them from touching you. But you fought them with ink. You fought them with a mind so brilliant it makes my ancient magic feel entirely inadequate." A weak, exhausted smile touched the corner of her pale lips. "I am just an archivist. Reading old laws is all I know how to do." "You are my equal," he corrected fiercely, his grip tightening fractionally on her waist. "You are the Luna of this fortress. But I need you to understand exactly what that means. I need you to understand the gravity of the connection we just awakened." Evangeline's smile faded. The solemn, heavy tone of his voice demanded her full attention. She pulled the edges of his heavy velvet cloak tighter around her trembling shoulders, the residual heat of his body trapped in the fabric, offering a strange, deep comfort. "I understand that they want to kill me. Lord Garrick made that abundantly clear. Garrick was just a symptom." Kaelin sighed, resting his forehead briefly against the curve of her shoulder. The intimacy of the gesture, the sheer physical weight of the Dark Ruler seeking comfort from a fragile human, made her breath hitch. He pulled back, his amber eyes completely serious. "For 70 years, I ruled this empire through fear. I was untouchable because I had nothing to lose. No family, no mate. I was a hollow weapon. The rival factions obeyed me because they knew I would not hesitate to burn myself alive just to take them with me." He reached up, gently brushing a stray strand of hair away from her cheek. His lethal claws were fully retracted, his touch softer than the brush of a feather. "But now, they know I have a weakness," Kaelin continued, the words vibrating with a dark, suppressed terror. They felt the ancient bond ignite. They smelled your scent mixed with mine. The entire northern continent will soon know that the Sovereign of Shadows has a human mate. A mate without fangs, without a wolf, without the physical strength to survive a lichen challenge. Evangeline felt a cold knot form in the center of her stomach. The safety of the warm sanctuary suddenly felt fragile, a thin glass bubble floating in an ocean of monsters. They will come for me to get to you. They will try. Kalen agreed, his voice dropping to a gravelly, possessive whisper. The molten gold flared briefly in his eyes, a flare of the protective beast lurking just beneath the surface. They will use politics, they will use poison, they will use siege tactics. They will stop at nothing to eliminate you, because breaking our tether will completely shatter my mind. It is the only way to destroy a Lycan king. He shifted closer, his massive chest brushing against her knees. He took both of her small hands in his, pressing them against the center of his chest, right over his racing heart. She could feel the heavy, frantic thud of the muscle beneath his tailored garments, a perfect, synchronized echo of her own pulse. I sealed the iron deadbolts today because it was the only way to contain the immediate threat without exposing you to the outer guards, Kalen confessed, laying his soul completely bare. I roared my claim so loudly the ancestors heard it, because I needed every beast in that room to understand that your life and mine are now legally and biologically identical. But the true danger begins tomorrow, when those doors must open. Evangeline stared at the man kneeling on her floor. She saw the heavy crown of obsidian pressing down on his broad shoulders. She saw the centuries of loneliness, the desperate, hollow ache that had finally been filled, only to be immediately threatened by a violent world. She remembered the terror she had felt, standing alone in the grand chamber. But looking into his eyes now, eyes the color of molten gold, stripped of all royal pretense and burning with absolute, unwavering devotion, she realized she was no longer fighting a solitary war. The crushing isolation she had carried since she first picked up the scroll dissolved into the heat of his touch. She did not pull her hands away from his chest. Instead, she pressed her palms firmer against the frantic rhythm of his heart, silently matching its beat. "Then let them come," she whispered. Her voice was no louder than the crackle of the hearth, but it held the unbending strength of the iron deadbolts he had thrown across the doors. "I did not come to the obsidian fortress to hide, Kalen. I came to secure a future, and I will burn the entire kingdom to the ground before I allow that to happen." Kalen released a breath that sounded like a fractured sob, the last remnants of his feral tension snapping like a brittle twig. He leaned forward, burying his face in the soft crook of her neck. He breathed her in, his large frame shuddering as the ancient magic of the soul link settled deeply into their bones. The golden soul bond thread tethered them together, glowing with an invisible but palpable heat. It smelled of honey and rain, a perfect, absolute sanctuary. She was not a pawn, not used, not owned, chosen. "Mine," Kalen rasped against her skin, the word no longer a violent claim of possession, but a desperate prayer of gratitude. "Yours," Evangeline answered softly, her fingers gently threading through his dark hair. The warmth of the room and the overwhelming safety of his embrace finally overtook her exhausted senses. As the fire crackled in the hearth, painting the heavy crimson tapestries in shades of ember, her heavy eyelids closed. She drifted into a deep, healing sleep, safe in the arms of the Sovereign, who would tear the world apart to keep her there. Consciousness returned to the young archivist, not with the violent, frantic jolt of a survival instinct, but through a slow, luxurious drift upward through layers of profound warmth. The biting, bone-deep chill of the northern mountains, a cold that had lived in her marrow for 3 grueling days of travel, was entirely eradicated. In its place was a dense, saturated heat that smelled of crackling pine sap, crushed cedar, and the deep, grounding aroma of apex power. Evangeline kept her weary eyelids closed for a long moment, simply mapping the new geography of her own body. She was lying on a mattress so deep and plush it felt like sinking into a physical cloud, covered by a heavy mountain of thick, impossibly soft pelts and woven blankets. The frantic, chaotic terror of the throne room, the bared fangs, the shouts of treason, the horrifying lunge of Lord Garrick, felt like a distant nightmare. It was separated from her current reality by an impenetrable fortress of ancient magic. In the center of her chest taut, the golden soul bond thread pulsed with a steady, rhythmic cadence. It was no longer the shocking, violent electrical current of its initial explosive awakening. The magical tether had settled into a slow, warm river of liquid silver, humming in perfect synchronization with a heartbeat that was undeniably not her own. This ethereal connection was an absolute biological anchor, whispering of safety, absolute possession, and an unyielding territorial devotion. She slowly fluttered her eyes open. The private chambers of the monarch were bathed in the soft, bruised light of the early pre-dawn hours. The colossal stone hearth on the far wall was still roaring with life, the ancient cedar logs snapping and popping in the otherwise quiet room, casting long dancing shadows across the heavy crimson tapestries that lined the stone walls. It was a sanctuary designed for ultimate isolation, a perfect, impenetrable nesting room where the harshness of the outside world ceased to exist. And he was there. Calen Valerius had not slept. The Alpha King sat in a high-backed leather chair, drawn flush to the edge of the mattress, his imposing frame perfectly still, entirely focused on her resting form. He had discarded his formal, heavy royal coat, wearing only a loose, dark linen shirt that clung to the broad, corded muscles of his chest and shoulders. The sheer physical size of the man was still breathtaking, a monument of lethal grace and dark, aristocratic perfection. But it was his eyes that seized the breath directly from her lungs. The molten gold irises burned in the dim, flickering firelight, tracking the subtle rise and fall of her chest with a desperate, starving intensity. He watched her, like a man who had been wandering a frozen desert for a century, finally finding a single drop of water. The moment her breathing pattern shifted, indicating she was fully awake, the tension locked in his broad shoulders fractured. He leaned forward instantly, closing the small physical distance between them. The sheer gravitational pull of his presence was overwhelming, a localized storm of protective energy that wrapped around her like a heavy, invisible shield. "You are awake," the sovereign rasped. His voice was a low, velvet-wrapped rumble that vibrated directly against her delicate collarbones. He reached out, his movements agonizingly slow, explicitly telegraphing his intent so as not to startle her fragile human reflexes. His large, calloused hand cupped the side of her face. The lethal claws were fully retracted, his touch softer than the brush of a falling leaf against her pale skin. "I am," Evangeline whispered, turning her cheek slightly into the burning, glorious heat of his palm. The natural human instinct to pull away from a terrifying apex predator was completely gone, overwritten by the fundamental, biological truth of their shared existence. "How long did I sleep?" "Through the entire night," he answered, his thumb tracing the delicate line of her jaw with an almost religious reverence. He looked at her as if she were a fragile miracle he still could not quite believe was real. "Your heart rate has completely stabilized. The ancient magic has woven itself into your nervous system without causing further shock. You survived the integration, my beautiful, brave emissary." She let out a long, shaky exhale, the reality of her survival finally cementing itself in her tired mind. She pushed herself up slightly, the thick furs pooling around her waist. The ambient air of the chamber was incredibly warm, but a subtle, creeping draft near the high-arched window betrayed the harsh reality of the geography outside. "It is morning. Then the dawn has come." Caelan's expression darkened fractionally, the molten gold in his eyes swirling with a sudden violent storm-glass grey. The reminder of the outside world, of the ruthless politics and the violence waiting beyond the heavy oak doors, triggered his dominant territorial instincts. He pulled his hand back slightly, his sharp jaw clenching. "The courtyard is being prepared," the Dark Ruler stated, his tone shifting rapidly from gentle devotion to cold, regal absolute. The High Council, the Border Lords, and the elite guard have assembled. But you do not have to witness it, Evangeline. You can remain here in the warmth. I will lock the seals myself. I will step outside, sever the traitors from this earth, and return to you before the sun fully clears the horizon. Evangeline looked at the magnificent, terrifying man sitting beside her. She felt the violent, protective urge radiating through the ancient tether connecting their chests. He wanted to shield her from the brutality of his violent world. He wanted to keep her locked in a beautiful, warm cage where nothing could ever frighten her again. But she remembered the arrogant, mocking sneer of Lord Garrick. She remembered the hostile lords whispering about how a human mate was a liability, a pathetic weakness that would shatter the crown. If she hid in this room while he spilled blood in her name, she would prove them right. She would always be a vulnerability he had to carry, rather than a Luna who could stand on her own 2 feet. No, the young archivist said. Her voice was quiet, but it possessed a core of unyielding steel that made the monarch blink in genuine surprise. She pushed the thick blankets aside, swinging her bare legs over the edge of the mattress. I did not come to the northern mountains to hide in the shadows, Kaelin. If they are to be executed for treason against the crown and for threatening my enclave, I will stand beside you. They will look at me before they die, and they will know that the human they called a parasite is the one who sealed their ultimate fate. A profound, staggering silence stretched between them. Kaelin stared at her, the feral beast beneath his skin, completely stunned by the sheer magnificent courage radiating from his physically fragile mate. Then, a slow, devastatingly beautiful smile broke across the sharp, aristocratic lines of his face. The pride that flooded their connection was so intense it actually made her gasp, a tidal wave of golden warmth that left her dizzy. You will be the absolute ruin of my enemies, he murmured, dropping to one knee before her, pressing a burning, reverent kiss to the back of her hand, and the absolute salvation of my spirit. A measured, deliberate knock echoed against the thick wood of the chamber doors. Kaelin's head snapped up, a low warning growl rumbling deep in his chest, but he did not rise from his kneeling position. Enter, he commanded. Elder Cynthia Sterling stepped across the threshold, her head bowed in deep, unwavering respect. The royal physician carried a solid silver tray. Upon it rested a fresh vial of medicine and a neatly folded pile of magnificent, dark fabric. She approached the bed with cautious, measured steps, keeping her eyes averted from the intense, possessive glare of the Alpha King. Forgive the intrusion, Alpha, Luna, the wise elder spoke, using Evangeline's new title with a natural, unquestioning reverence that made the young woman's heart skip a beat. I have prepared the warming draught. It is brewed with fermented willow bark and fire root. It will fortify the Luna's human blood against the freezing wind of the outer courtyard. The transition from the nesting room to the outer walls will be physically taxing. Evangeline accepted the vial and drank it quickly. The bitter herbal mixture burned a clean, sharp trail down her throat, instantly clearing the last remnants of sleep from her mind and flooding her veins with a localized, defensive heat that radiated all the way to her fingertips. And the garments? Kaelin asked, his eyes sweeping over the solid silver tray. The traditional raiment of the sovereign's mate, crafted from the royal vaults. Elder Cynthia explained softly, stepping back to give them space. Woven with thermal enchantments and lined with winter fox pelt. It will provide the necessary physical protection and convey the absolute authority required for a public judgment. The dressing process was a silent, solemn ritual. Kaelin dismissed the physician with a sharp nod, taking the substantial garments into his own hands. He helped Evangeline dress, his large, lethal hands handling the delicate silk and dense fur with excruciating, meticulous care. The gown was a breathtaking expanse of midnight blue velvet, intricately embroidered with the silver, stylized crest of the Lycan Empire. It was incredibly grounding, giving her a tangible physical weight of the absolute power she now possessed. Finally, the sovereign picked up his own heavy royal mantle, the exact same dark, fur-lined cloak He had wrapped her in during the terror of the throne room. He settled it over her shoulders, the thick silver clasp clicking securely into place at her delicate collarbone. The cloak was vast, trailing on the stone floor behind her, saturated entirely with his overwhelming scent of cedar and frost. It was a physical claim, a visual warning to the entire empire that she belongs to him. "Are you ready?" Kaelan asked, offering his strong arm. Evangeline took a deep, steadying breath. She felt the golden river in her chest pulsing with calm, immovable strength. "I am ready, my king." They walked out of the sanctuary, the heavy oak doors closing behind them with a definitive thud. The journey through the cavernous halls of the Sovereign's Keep was a stark, almost unbelievable contrast to her arrival the day before. Yesterday, she had been a terrified, invisible human creeping through the shadows, clutching a scroll. Today, she walked arm in arm with the most dangerous creature on the continent. The wide corridors were lined with heavily armored elite guards. As the royal couple passed, the towering lichen warriors did not merely bow. They dropped to one knee, striking their armored chests with their fists in a deafening, perfectly synchronized salute. There was no hesitation, no murmurs of dissent. The scent of the awakened ancient tether preceded them, and the primal instincts of the guards recognized their true Luna without question. They reached the colossal iron-shod barriers that led to the outer battlements. With a gesture from the monarch, the colossal mechanisms groaned and pulled back. The solid stone door swung open, admitting a blinding rush of pale, purple-tinged dawn light and a blast of freezing Arctic wind. Evangeline did not shiver. The enchanted garments and the burning physical proximity of her mate kept the cold entirely at bay. She stepped out onto the raised obsidian balcony, overlooking the main courtyard, and the sheer scale of what awaited them stole the breath directly from her lungs. The courtyard was a vast, frozen expanse of black stone, and it was completely full. Thousands of wolves and lichens, representing the combined military might of the northern packs, stood in absolute terrifying silence beneath the bruised morning sky. The collective breath of the gathered army rose in a dense, shifting cloud of white mist against the freezing air. At the center of the courtyard, a raised platform of rough-hewn granite had been cleared of snow. As Kaelan Valerius stepped up to the edge of the balcony, a suffocating, crushing pressure descended over the entire fortress. It was the raw, unbridled aura of an apex predator asserting total, undisputed dominance. The silence in the courtyard deepened until the only sound was the howling of the winter wind through the high stone's towers. Down on the granite platform, the prisoners were waiting. Lord Garrick was forced to his knees in the freezing slush. The former commander was completely unrecognizable from the arrogant, towering warlord who had threatened to snap Evangeline's neck just 24 hours prior. He was utterly broken. The crushing gravity magic Kaelan had unleashed during the confrontation had shattered his physical pride and broken his spirit. His thick arms were bound in heavy iron chains, his skin bruised and pale, shivering violently in the biting cold. Beside him, the other conspirators were entirely prostrate on the ice. They were weeping openly, their bodies racked with pathetic, desperate sobs. The political ambition that had driven them to challenge the crown had completely evaporated, leaving behind only the raw, biological terror of prey cornered by a monster. Kaelan looked down at them, his face an immaculate, flawless mask of divine judgment. He did not need to shout. The acoustic magic of the royal balcony carried his dark, lethal voice to the furthest edges of the gathered army, thundering over the roaring wind. "The laws of the First Council are absolute," the Alpha King declared, the resonance of his voice vibrating in the chest of every single creature present. "Treason against the crown is punishable by death, but these men did not merely plot against the throne. They conspired to murder my fated mate. They conspired to extinguish the soul of this empire before it could even take its first breath." A collective, low rumble of aggressive, violent agreement rippled through the thousands of gathered soldiers. To a lichen, the fated mate connection was sacred, a direct blessing from the ancient gods. To threaten a recognized Luna was an abomination that triggered a violent, collective disgust among the pack. Kaelin turned slightly, extending a hand to Evangeline. She stepped forward to stand flush against the freezing stone railing, fully visible to the entire Empire. She kept her head lifted, her spine perfectly straight, the heavy royal mantle billowing slightly in the winter wind. She held the leather-bound charter clutched in her hands, no longer a desperate plea for survival, but a weapon of absolute legal supremacy. Down on the platform, the gaunt traitor lifted his face from the ice, his remaining eye wide with absolute horror as he looked at the fragile human woman standing above them in royal furs. The reality of his catastrophic miscalculation finally broke his mind. "Luna!" the gaunt lord screamed, his voice cracking hysterically as he attempted to crawl forward, dragging his thick iron chains through the snow. "Mercy! We were blind. We did not know the ancient magic was real. Please, Luna, ask the king for mercy. We beg of you." Evangeline looked down at the weeping, pathetic creature. She felt no pity, and she felt no cruel joy. She only felt the cold, hard weight of justice. She remembered the innocent human villages that had burned under their unauthorized raids. She remembered the terrified children of her enclave, hiding from Lycan hunting parties in the dark. She looked at Lord Garrick, the warlord who had called her a parasite, and she did not blink. She offered them the exact same dignity they had offered her people, absolute, unwavering silence. She did not beg for their lives, and she did not mock their deaths. Her silence was a devastating final judgment that echoed louder than any scream. She simply stepped back, yielding the floor entirely to the sovereign's absolute wrath. Kaelin's golden eyes flared with a lethal, possessive pride at her cold composure. He turned his attention back to the condemned. "You begged for the old laws, Lord Garrick," the king sneered, his voice dropping into a terrifying guttural purr that shook the stone beneath their feet. "And the old laws demand a blood price for the invasion of royal territory. The human enclave is under the direct, personal protection of the crown. Any beast who steps foot near her borders with ill intent will not face a trial. They will face me. The Dark Ruler did not draw a blade. He did not shift into a feral beast to tear their throats out, refusing to give them a messy, prolonged slaughter. He was a king, not a butcher." Kaelin raised his right hand, his long aristocratic fingers slowly curling inward into a tight fist. The ambient gravity on the granite platform violently multiplied by a factor of 10. The sound of snapping bone echoed sharply across the silent courtyard, like the cracking of glacial ice. It was instantaneous, brutal, and flawlessly executed. Lord Garrick and the treasonous lords collapsed entirely, their breathing stopping in perfect unison as the crushing magic extinguished their lives without a single drop of blood staining the white snow. It was over. The rebellion was completely, utterly eradicated. For a span of 3 long heartbeats, the vast courtyard remained frozen. Then, starting from the front ranks of the elite guard and rolling backward like an immense dark wave, the Empire submitted. Thousands of heavily armored warriors, giant shadow wolves, and veteran commanders dropped to their knees in the freezing snow. They bowed their heads, pressing their fists to the earth. They were not merely submitting to the terrifying power of Kaelin Valerius. They were bowing to the quiet human woman standing beside him, recognizing the unyielding steel in her spine and the ancient divine right of her presence. Evangeline watched an entire army kneel before her, and the crushing isolation of her past completely dissolved into the biting winter wind. Later, when the colossal gates secured by the iron deadbolts were sealed once more, and the weighty political burdens of the day were left in the frozen courtyard, they returned to the absolute privacy of the nesting room. The solid oak doors clicked shut, severing them from the world. The transition from the terrifying public executioner back to the devoted mate was instantaneous. The terrifying monarch, the man who had just crushed a warlord with a mere gesture, dropped to his knees on the thick rug before her. Kaelin let out a long, ragged exhale, a sound of profound emotional release that had been trapped in his chest for 70 years. He wrapped his powerful arms around her waist, burying his face in the soft folds of her velvet gown. Evangeline did not hesitate. She sank down to the floor with him, entirely uncaring of the yards of silk and royal embroidery. She cradled his dark head against her chest, her fingers weaving gently through his thick hair. The golden river in her chest pulsed with the blinding, overwhelming warmth. Some wounds could only be healed with love, and the century of agonizing loneliness that had hollowed out the king's soul was finally, permanently filled. "You are safe," Kaelan whispered against her skin, his voice thick with raw, unguarded devotion. "They will never touch you again. The entire northern kingdom is yours." The profound silence of the royal sanctuary was no longer a cage of isolation, but a sanctuary of unbreakable peace. The golden soul bond thread hummed between them, weaving their heartbeats into a singular, undeniable rhythm. She had stepped out of the shadows, enduring the freezing judgment of a brutal world, only to forge her own dawn. Kaelan held her tighter. The ferocious Alpha King, completely tamed by the quiet strength of the human who had claimed him back. Here, in the absolute warmth of their nesting room, the reign of their shared empire had finally begun. Thank you for listening to this story. She stepped aside once, believing herself unworthy. She will never step aside again. Let me know in the comments below. Where are you listening from tonight? Did the king grovel enough for your satisfaction? Subscribe to join our pack for more stories of quiet strength, ancient magic, absolute devotion.